What's up, plant junkies? Jody here for another plant video from plantjunkiecreations.com. I'm going to be going over the plant basics of this beautiful Pellionia repens, also known as Polynesian ivy. I'm also going to show you guys just how easy it is to propagate these plants. I'm not sure if you can see this portion right here, but it's not as developed as this section right here. When I first received my plant, it was very small, like this section, and I really wasn't sure what to think about it. And then it just like started putting off all these new growth points and trailing over, and before you know it, like it turned into my favorite plant. It's really an easy plant to take care of as well as to propagate. I have two varieties here. I have the lime green and green variety. The red variety. Has like a nice shimmer to it. The light requirement for this plant tolerates low to bright indirect light. Thrives best at medium bright indirect light. I currently have this plant down low with larger plants blocking that bright indirect light, so it's doing well. Like the colors are vibrant, so that tells me that it's loving that medium indirect light. This red variety I have in an east window, so the trailing parts are actually receiving that morning sunlight, whereas the top of this is getting that low light, and it's also encouraging it to trail down and to reach for that light, and that is why I did that. I took some propagations from the lime green variety and put it here because I thought it would be neat to combine these two varieties. So I'm just waiting for it to grow and trail on this end. The watering schedule for this plant really just depends on the size and what type of pot you're using. So I'm just going to talk about the pots that I have here. I experimented with a 4-inch terracotta, somewhat shallow pot, as well as a 6-inch larger pot. This one I water on a weekly basis. The terracotta dries it out, sucks that moisture out, so it needs a little bit more frequent watering. Whereas this one, I water on like a 10 to 14 day cycle. When to water? How do you know when to water? These plants prefer to stay on the moist side. They do not like being soggy. They do require a drainage hole because they don't like just sitting in water. So when you water this plant, let it drain out, water again, make sure it's evenly watered up top, because sometimes these trailing portions will develop roots and you can kind of just tuck this back into there. And if you're consistently watering on a weekly basis, it'll just those roots will grab onto that dirt, and you can cut right there and it'll put off a new little sprout, or you can just let it keep trailing over. That's what's so rad about this plant. It's just super easy to root. And then this one, I feel how heavy it is. Considering it's a big pot and it's plastic, you know, I'll just dip my finger in here, and at like the 2-inch mark, is when I'll water. So your first knuckle is 1 inch and your second knuckle is 2 inches. So if you go down 2 inches and you feel moist, you feel dryness at the tip, that's a good time to water. That's more for like developed plants. But when you have just propagated some plants, you want to keep them moist. So it's a little different. The soil requirement for these plants need a well-draining mix, but enough to stay moist and not dry out too frequently. I like to use a peat moss based, and then just like your indoor gardening potting mix with added perlite, and that's it. During the growing season, you'll want to fertilize your plants 2 times a month, so every other watering. It is really important because eventually your soil loses the nutrients it needs, and it needs us to help and fertilize them. So what I use is the same old stuff. I use the Gringo Rasta Rise Up combined with Super Thrive. I'll just mix this into a gallon of water, shake it up, and use it every other watering. Another alternative you can use that I find these plants really love is worm castings. You can use it in 2 different ways. The first method is you can sprinkle it on top of the soil and just water on top of it, and it'll suck up the nutrients that way. Or you can mix that into a gallon of water, shake it up, and water as is. Another great source is blood meal. I wouldn't recommend just sprinkling it on top, because if you don't have enough airflow, it could possibly develop mildew. So I highly recommend, if you use blood meal, which is a great source of nutrients, is mix it with that gallon of water, shake it up, use it that day. Just water a couple other plants while you're at it. It's the season to start propagating. The weather's warm, the plant is exploding with new growth, so the time is right now to choppity chop. Where I like to take my cuts is where I have a bruised or just damaged leaf, because I'll be cutting that part off. So when I'm taking my cutting, I will cut just below that ugly leaf. So I'm just going to cut that leaf off, and that's that. So now that you got your fresh cuts, you'll want to put, I highly encourage a root promoter. I use the Gringo Rasta Rise Up, and you can put this stuff either on the base or also on the bottom of that leaf there where the nodes are at. Since you have these fresh cuts, you want to immediately put them in sphagnum moss in a greenhouse. This is just a food container I use. I moisten the sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss looks like this. You don't want it soggy, you just want it moist enough. I have other plants in here. I have some string of hearts in there and silver glory. And the goal is to just keep that humidity in there and then put it under some grow lights. When you're sticking these cuttings into your sphagnum moss, it's important to get the base as well as these nodes touching the sphagnum moss. To maintain the humidity, you'll just want to mist it probably on a weekly or 2-week basis, just depending on how warm it is in your house. You just place the lid on there. You don't want the moss to dry out. You want to keep that moss moist. When you start taking cuts from your plant, you'll actually be promoting new growth. So here's a great example. You see 2 new growth points right there. If you enjoyed this video, remember to hit that like button. Also be sure to subscribe if you're interested in seeing more plant-related videos.